Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Eichhoff, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Associate Director for Alumni Relations at John Carroll University. Thank you for joining us this evening for our next installment of A.C.E.S, the Alumni Continuing Education Series. A.C.E.S was established in the spring of 2013 by the Office of Alumni Relations in the spirit of lifelong learning. The program offers enrichment opportunities for alumni and friends through the expertise of members of the JCU administration, faculty, staff, and our alumni community. While our world is beginning to reopen, we will continue to offer programming online like this so that all of our alumni, regardless of where they call home, can connect with the university and with one another. Before I introduce our featured speaker, I wanted to share a few housekeeping items. First, we encourage you to view the program in full screen mode. Additionally, ensure that you stay muted throughout the duration of tonight's program. Following Dr. Murphy's presentation, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. Please utilize the chat feature for your questions. You can enter them at any time. I will curate the questions and ask Dr. Murphy on your behalf, and as many as possible. Thank you. It is now my honor to introduce our presenter for this evening. Professor Paul V. Murphy focuses his research on religious and cultural history of the 16th and 17th century Italy. He is the author of Ruling Peacefully, Cardinal Ercole Gonzaga, and Patrician Reform in the 16th Century Italy, CUA Press, 2007, as well as a number of articles and book chapters. He is currently working on an edition of the autobiography of an early Jesuit named Pedro de Ribañera, who is the first biographer of Ignatius of Loyola. He teaches courses on the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Jesuits, and the papacy. In addition to his work in the Department of History, he holds the Breen Chair in Catholic Studies and serves as the director of the Institute for Catholic Studies. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Murphy. Good evening, Paul. Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, the floor is yours.
Hello to all of you. It's wonderful to see familiar faces and also future students at John Carroll. I see Rosanna Violi is there with at least one of her daughters. How are you there? Got maybe two of them. I think, Paul Holtzman convinced them to come to school here in about 12 years. All right. John Cunningham, nice to see you. Ed Hannenberg, I didn't see you at work today, but there we go, like this. What I want to do is, let's see, talk about this experience that we have, that we're going through this year of the 500th anniversary of the conversion of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And of course, the occasion was that on May 21st, 1521, he was seriously injured in a battle at Pamplona in Spain. And many people are referring to this as the Cannonball Moment. Now, many of you, as Jesuit graduates, are familiar with the outlines of this story. So what I'm going to be trying to do is sort of shed some light or ask some questions and perhaps give some perspective on things in a new way, hopefully. And the first question I have, and this is where I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian here, is why are we talking about the Cannonball Moment? On one level, of course, it was obvious it was a turning point in his life. Commentators in the last few months have likened it to the turning points in our own lives. Some have even suggested there's a society that we in this, as we hope to get out of this pandemic, that we ourselves have had a cannonball moment. But the cannonball moment was in fact only a beginning and not, I'm going to argue, a very admirable moment in his life, as he himself, I think, really intended as he was dictating his autobiography many years later. He included the events at Pamplona in his autobiography, along with a number of other somewhat embarrassing stories, to underline just how much work God had to do in him. He was a tough case, really. And we have to ask ourselves, how big a turning point was it? If we don't want to get distracted from other things that he or that God did in his life. So it is a big moment, and it's only the beginning. When we ask ourselves, when we talk about conversion, I think in the popular imagination, conversion is often treated as if it is a dramatic, sudden event. Think of the great hymn, Amazing Grace. I was lost, and now I'm found. I was blind, and now I see. A black and white relationship between before and after. Even perhaps the story of the most famous Christian convert of them all, St. Paul of Tarsus, on the road to Damascus. He gets struck to the ground, he gets up, he hears a voice, and his life is changed. Is this an accurate depiction of how conversion takes place in human terms in most people? And that's one of the reasons why historians of religion and sociologists of religion are fascinated by stories of conversion, because they are complex human stories as well as stories of God's grace. Again, conversion really, we have to keep in mind, is a process, all right? It often includes great moments of change, cannonball moments, but it is also a never-ending process. Father Arturo Sosa, who's the current Superior General of the Society of Jesus, gave a talk not so long ago on this anniversary, and he said, conversion consists sometimes of great moments of change, but it is also a never-ending process. We need to put Christ in the center every time, again and again. This process is a pilgrimage along winding roads, up and down, sometimes having to retrace our steps, sometimes feeling lost, but meeting people along the road who indicate the way and reach out their hands to us. Conversion as a journey that is really never ending. So it's good to remember that even the Superior General of the Jesuits is emphasizing this. And for Ignatius, it was a long process. It took a long time for this to get worked out. It was not an I was blind and now I see. He thought he could see, but it was amazing how blind he was for several months after getting hit in the cannon with a cannonball. So first, let me start in talking about this actual narrative of Ignatius's own life and remind us all of where he was coming from. In other words, what did he need to be converted from? He was born Iñigo de Loyola in the town of Aspecia in the Basque region of Spain in 1491. That is, in Spain's golden age. He was born of the lower nobility, the youngest of many children. He was not going to inherit the farm. He really didn't have many prospects at all. He was somebody who was going to have to work hard. He was going to have to be a climber. But as he grows, and I want to emphasize this, he was imbued with the ideals of chivalry and a Spanish sense of personal honor. He was un hidalgo, a gentleman in that Spanish, late medieval, Renaissance Spanish sense of the term, one whose life is very much based on pride in one's place in society and the need to defend that place and that honor. He wasn't very admirable. He admits it himself. Quoting from his autobiography, he says that he was careless about gambling, affairs with women, brawls, and the use of arms. No Francis of Assisi was he. In fact, one of the few legal documents we have demonstrating his presence in his hometown involves a legal case in which he and some friends apparently jumped someone in an alleyway. So this was not someone who at the beginning of the story is all that, in some ways, attractive. The world that psychologically he occupies in some ways can be seen in this painting that I have on the right. That is it's called The Burial of the Count Orgaz by El Greco, which hangs in the church of San Tomé in the city of Toledo in Spain. And there you see at the bottom of the picture, the dead Count Orgaz being borne by clergy of the Spanish Counter-Reformation, surrounded by monks and other clergy. Behind him are assembled the grandees of Spain, this nobility to which Ignatius aspired. And of course, above that, the whole heavenly host, all of worldly and religious reality blended into one vision, where the Spanish national character is very much identified with Catholicism in that era. That's the world of Ignatius. Now, I want to underline that Iñigo was a courtier. And I want to say that because it's often said that Ignatius was a soldier. And he wasn't. He was not. If you take one thing away from here, if you want to go and shock your friends, tell them Paul Murphy says Ignatius was not a soldier. They won't believe you anyhow. But he was really a courtier, which is to say he was someone who in his youth and his young adulthood honed his skills working at the courts of noble Spain. That is to say, he learned things that weren't so much appropriate for combat as appropriate for the diplomacy and politics of an early modern monarchical society. That is to say, he became adept in Spanish language, and Spanish was his second language. Penmanship, of which he was very proud, his handwriting was very clear. Diplomatic skills in a court setting, and even music. He encounters during this era of his life, when he's actually living at a fairly high-level court, he encounters the royal court. He, in fact, met King Ferdinand of Spain. And during this time, he dreamed, as of course he read about this in all the stories of knightly literature, he dreamed of attaining the favor of a highborn woman. No chance. He's too low-born for that. He's dreaming, you might say he's punching above his weight, but his weight is pretty little, all right? He has to actually come to terms with the limitations of his life. Now, about 1516, the man who had been his employer got into trouble with the king and then died. And so Iñigo, like anybody else, had to find a new job. He goes back to the Basque region of Spain. He gets a job working for the Duke of Nájera, a duke in northern Spain. And as a part of that, he's sent off at one point to participate in a military campaign for the first time in his life in 1521. Where the city of Pamplona, which sits close even today to the border between France and Spain, is held by Spanish troops, but is under siege by French soldiers who are well armed with the very modern artillery of their day, siege engines, and of course they outnumber the people in the city about 10-1. This is not a good situation, especially, as I say, if you're a courtier more than a soldier. I said he's not a soldier. You have to keep in mind, he probably spent about 2 weeks of his entire life on active duty, on campaign. He really didn't know that much about how to conduct oneself in a siege. So why was he wounded, and why does he tell this story? One of the things I'm going to come back to is that in the early part of the autobiography, he tells a lot of stories that no sane person today would include in their autobiography. They're actually kind of embarrassing. He's wounded at the siege of Pamplona because, in fact, the whole city is ready to surrender, and he convinces them to hold out. Now, you could tell this as a story of gallantry and courage. You can also tell this as a story of foolhardiness, of recklessness. But he convinces them to hold out until on the 21st of May, the French artillery breaches the walls. He jumps into the breach in the wall, and he is hit with a cannonball and in one leg and injured with debris on the other one. Both legs injured, he goes down. This resulted, and he wants to emphasize this, from his pride and his rashness. This is the Cannonball Moment. How does it change his life? And one could ask, from the perspective of Catholic just war theory, How many people died that day because of his pride and rashness? He was, in fact, a narcissistic, vainglorious, aging courtier. 1521, he was 30 years old by this time. I often like to say he was a little bit like an aging athlete who undergoes a career-ending injury. Well, his conversion experience really starts from there. He undergoes, as I'm sure you know some of this, a very painful convalescence. French knights treat him as well as they can. They set his leg, they put him on a stretcher, people carry him back to Loyola. He gets into the castle. They look at his leg, and the doctors at Loyola say, you know, they did a bad job on this, or it was re-injured on the way to Loyola. We need to break this leg again, which they did. And then after they broke it, they looked at it again, and they realized, or he realized, it's way too short. It's off center. Break it again. It was broken a second time, stretched out. And then, even then, he notices that bone is protruding from one part of his lower leg. And he, still wanting to be a courtier at this point, still wanting to gain the favor of a high-born woman, you know, be a knight in shining armor, he is a typical Renaissance courtier who would have wanted to wear either the sort of tightly fitting hosiery that the men wore at that time to show off their sexy legs, if I dare say it, or those high boots that were so fashionable in the 16th century. And he couldn't have gotten those on with that bulge from the bone. And so, in a tremendous act of willfulness, he orders the doctors to saw off the protruding piece of bone. Whoopa, whoopa, whoopa. Think of it. No anesthetic, probably a double ration of brandy and a leather strap in his mouth so he didn't bite his tongue off in pain. Now, this tells us a couple of things. This is a man who, when he decides to do something, will accomplish it. He is a very strong-willed individual. He is also someone who is still addicted to the dreams of his youth. In fact, this is so serious that he nearly died because he was not ready to give up on the courtly life. Nevertheless, he survives this, but has to spend months lying in this sick bed in the castle at Loyola. And as you know, when you're sick, it can get kind of boring after a while. Some of you may have been in quarantine in the last 18 months. My wife sent me to the attic and didn't want to see me for 2 weeks, you know? They just threw books up the stairs to me. Well, Ignatius had the same issue with boredom and how to occupy himself. He had read many stories of knights, of stories of chivalry, of these knights in shining armor, battling dragons, wooing noble women, queens. And he had all of those stories memorized. They were kind of on his personal hard drive, so to speak. But there were only 2 books in the whole castle, which wouldn't have been unusual. Books were still very expensive in those days. And the only 2 books were not books of chivalry. They were books of religion. One of them being A Life of Christ, a well-known Life of Christ by a man named Ludolf of Saxony, and something called the Golden Legend, which was really the lives of the saints by a man named Jacobus de Voragine. And so he's got 2 things to occupy himself. He is a person who has tremendous imaginative powers. He could spend 2, 3, maybe even 4 hours deeply engrossed imagining specific situations. He could imagine what it was like to be a knight again, to be a warrior, to be on the top of another bastion, winning glory for himself and for his king. And he could do this for hours. And then he would read these other books. And he would read stories of Jesus, of being at the Sermon on the Mount, of what it would been like to walk along a dusty road outside of Jerusalem of what it would have been like to wander around Italy with St. Francis of Assisi or St. Dominic. And he could spend 2 or 3 or 4 hours doing that. Powerful imaginative faculties. But what he noticed as he alternated between these things, between daydreaming about worldly events or religious ones, was something different. And it wasn't out there, it was in here. It was inside himself. It was an interior experience. He began to notice that whereas he could be very excited about the idea of imitating Lancelot, let's say, when he was in the imaginative exercise itself, when he stepped outside of it, he felt dry. He felt desolation, as he would call it. But when he meditated on the life of Christ, or when he meditated on the lives of the saints, and he would do this for hours and then he would step out of it, he would realize he actually didn't feel desolate. He felt consolation. He felt an ongoing joy. He felt a peace. And this is what he noticed, which is the very crude beginnings of Ignatian discernment. And it's all based on being attentive to what's going on in one's own experience. Around this time, he also has a vision, pictured here in this woodcut here, of the Blessed Virgin and Child. And he remembers actually having an experience of revulsion at all of his earlier sins, and he chooses definitively at that moment to give it up. So this is an important moment on his way to conversion, but it's still only about the second step. We've had the Cannonball experience. We've had the experience of wanting perhaps to follow Christ and imitate the saints more fully. He, however, is still rather naive and somewhat egotistical in this, in the fact that sometimes in his desire to imitate the saints, ironically, he's doing it in a kind of with the competitiveness with which he had grown up. It was as if he said, oh, St. Francis was humble, so I'm going to be every bit as humble and even more humble than Francis. I'm going to be more humble than Francis of Assisi, which of course is by definition an egotistical way of proceeding. And he's constantly measuring himself against St. Humphrey. He loved St. Humphrey. He was a man who threw himself into thorn bushes, I think, when he had sexual thoughts, St. Francis and St. Dominic. But it is the beginning of the discernment of spirits. And it is the point when he sets aside his earlier life, especially, as he said, as regards matters of the flesh, all right? He was going to move beyond that. Well, after his leg has healed up, he enters a further stage. It's interesting to note that throughout his autobiography, he always refers to himself as the Pilgrim, not the ex-soldier, not the nobleman, not the priest, not the founder of a religious order. He just says the Pilgrim. And he decides that he's going to go on pilgrimage actually to Jerusalem, which was a very, very typical thing for the pious of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance to do. His family is already seeing that he's had some change, that he might want to give up the sort of so-called gilded existence of a Spanish noble. So he actually has to lie to his brother about what he's doing. He sneaks out of the house essentially and rides a donkey. He's heading off to Barcelona where he can get on a boat to take him to the Holy Land. And a funny thing happens, and this is another one of these stories that he tells where you wonder, why would you put this in your autobiography? He has an encounter, a famous encounter with a Moor. As you know, Spain the Spanish Christians had reconquered the Iberian Peninsula from the Moors only in the previous generation. And so there were still a lot of Moors living in Spain. As he's riding along the road on his donkey, a Moor comes up and rides beside him. And the two of them start having a conversation. Here he is, the Christian knight, still with one foot in the world of chivalry, still carrying a knife, still carrying a sword, and the Moor. And they start talking about theology in 16th century Spain. Gee, what could go wrong with that? Hard enough today. In any event, they're talking about the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the Moor suggests that he could buy that the Blessed Virgin had remained a virgin up to the birthing of Christ, but that afterwards, she couldn't have been a virgin. Well, this idea, of course, not only annoyed Iñigo, it enraged him. And he's trying to figure out what to do. And there's part of him, the person who was born and raised in the honor culture of late medieval and Renaissance Spain, who thinks he must avenge the honor of this, as he would see it, highest born lady and kill the Moor, or turn away from that and leave him alone. But he's having trouble discerning what he should do here. I know, to you and me, it might be very clear. He's trying to discern it. And at one point, the Moor, probably seeing that he was very angry, rode ahead and went off on a side road to a town up ahead. And Ignatius is watching this, and he says to himself, or he says to God, I don't know what to do. I am putting down the reins of the donkey, and if the donkey follows the Moor into town, I'll go and kill the Moor. If the donkey stays on the main road and does not go in that direction, I will not kill the Moor. This is how naive he is in his practice of discernment at this time. He doesn't know how to make a decision, really. And so he lets the reins go, and thanks be to God, the donkey did not go into that town, which led actually a Protestant church historian once to make the comment that on that day, the entire future history of the Catholic Counter-Reformation was determined by the decision of an ass. So he's still very early on. He's beyond the Cannonball Moment. He's beyond the recuperation in the Loyola Castle. He's on the road as a pilgrim, but he's still struggling. It's at this point that he actually ends up at the famous monastic shrine of Montserrat in Catalonia in northeastern Spain, not far from Barcelona. He goes there, he stays at Montserrat, he engages in further spiritual reading, does a retreat, so to speak, and he makes a general confession to a Benedictine monk. Now, a general confession is a confession of his whole life's sins. So it's sort of a general examine of everything he's done in his whole life. He's trying to put it all behind him. He's trying to make a clean slate. And so he makes this general confession. This is a clear sign that he wants to make a break. That's why Montserrat's an important moment in this ongoing, continuing conversion. And then famously, he keeps vigil before the Black Madonna of Montserrat. And he hangs up his sword and his dagger on the grate in front of the Madonna. And this is the image of it here that's still in the monastic church at Montserrat. He is making a change, but keep in mind, this is once again actually a gesture that comes right out of the literature of chivalry, of Amadis of Gaul, a French writer, where the knight hangs up his dagger and his sword before he goes off on crusade. He's sort of doing that, except that he leaves the sword and the knife, the dagger there. So he's still kind of egocentric. He's still fairly vain. He's going to be as good as any of those knights or holy men before. He's still somewhat narcissistic, but now in a religious sense. He's now unlikely to kill anybody, at the very least, since he has in fact disarmed himself at Montserrat. A 31-year-old, balding, limping man who's given up his money and even traded his clothes to a beggar. He's making a definitive change. He would have, if he had had his druthers, go all the way to Barcelona and gotten on a boat for the Holy Land. But plague had arrived in Barcelona, and that prolonged his stay in Catalonia. He spent nearly a year in the town of Manresa, which you can see there in the photograph. This is looking across the river, the Cardener, towards the cathedral in Manresa, near where he actually lived for much of the time in a cave. In discussing these early days of his life with an early companion, he referred to this period at Manresa as his primitive church. It's really where Ignatius of Loyola learned to be a Christian in the deepest sense of the term. That's why so many Jesuit retreat houses are actually called Manresa Retreat House. At first, his prayer was very intense. He was praying nearly all day. He was participating in liturgies at the local church. He was talking to the Dominicans who were there. He practiced extreme mortifications, fasting, whipping himself, and perhaps out of a rejection of his earlier vanity, especially about his appearance, about which he had been so careful. In fact, he'd butchered his leg for the sake of a good pair of shoes, when you think about it. He wants to reject that completely, so he just stops cutting his hair, he stops cutting his fingernails, he stops cutting his toenails. He must have looked like a wild man, absolutely nuts, right? In an extreme sense. But in a way, it is a very typical ascetic way of life coming in the Christian tradition from all the way back to the Desert Fathers of the 3rd and the 4th century in Egypt and Syria, but in a very extreme way. Again, he's still quite competitive. He is trying to earn his salvation. Part of the problem he had was that he was experiencing scruples. Now, I need to say something about what scruples are. You know, it's often seen as a compliment when you say someone is scrupulous about carrying out their professional duties with the highest level of care. So being scrupulous can be seen today generally perhaps as something positive, but scruples was a definite negative at that time for Ignatius, and he certainly perceived it in that way, because scruples are really an excessive concern for one's own sinfulness and shortcomings. When one suffers from scruples, one's constantly noting where one falls short. It is effectively a lack of confidence in the love and mercy of God and an excessive concern about oneself. So in an oddly, obsessively religious way, it too is egocentric to be engaged in scruples. And the problem he had was he was so sort of dug into these scruples that although he'd go to confession to the Dominicans in Manresa, he would find that soon afterwards he'd say he'd remember something he hadn't confessed, or he felt he hadn't confessed something adequately, or he'd think back to sins that he had confessed in his general confession to the Benedictine up at Montserrat, and he would say, oh no, I didn't really say how bad that was. He kept going back to the things that he'd already confessed. And so even when his spiritual directors and his confessors told him to leave it alone, he couldn't. He was kind of trapped in an unfreedom about his own shortcomings. So it really is, these scruples were manifesting a kind of egotistical tendency in a very negative way. How was he going to get out of it? And here's an interesting turning point, because originally he thought what I should do is I'll go to the confessor and I'll have him tell me to stop it. Ever had anybody solve one of your problems by having someone else merely tell you to stop it and then you just stopped it? Things don't happen that way, right? He tried it and it worked for a day or two, and then he'd be back to feeling scrupulous about these things all over again. Or he learned to the example of a saint. Again, he's comparing himself to an external person, a saint, who had scruples and solved it by engaging in some extreme fasting. So he did what that saint did, but it didn't work. Nothing external to him would solve his scruples. And finally, he found liberation. And he wrote of it this way, or he dictated it. This autobiography was dictated to his friends. He said, there came to him some feeling of disgust for the life he was leading, and some impulses to cease from it. And from this, the Lord willed that he woke up as if from a sleep. And since he now had some experience of the difference in kind of spirits, this ability to determine through desolation and consolation the presence of God, because he had some experience of that, he began to mull over the means through which that spirit had come. As a result, he decided with great clarity not to confess anything from the past anymore. Thus, from that day onward, he remained free of scruples, holding it for certain that our Lord in his mercy had willed to liberate him. That the Lord in his mercy had willed to liberate him. Now, I got to tell you, I can remember reading this when I was 21 years old, and it didn't make any sense to me then. It almost sounded like something magical had happened. It didn't make any sense. But what I began to realize over the years as I've reread this is that this was a critical moment in his conversion, because up until then, he thought he could rely on external authorities. He thought he could have a confessor tell him, stop it, and he'd stop. That didn't work. Or he could imitate another saint, somebody else's religious experience, not his, somebody else's. But that didn't work either. The resolution to his scruples came from within himself, and through the direct experience of God. This is one of the reasons why some people thought of him as a heretic in 16th century Spain. Isn't God supposed to be mediated through the church and the sacraments and all kinds of devotions? But Ignatius is emphasizing an interiority. You want to get free to your scruples? Go deep in yourself and listen to God. He recognized that the Spirit's moving within him, and he came to believe that he could discern the will of God, and then he could leave them aside in God's love, mercy, and grace. While in Manresa, moreover, especially once he gets over his scruples, he engages in what he calls the helping of souls, to help souls. That's a great phrase. He uses it over and over again in the autobiography. In fact, it's quite interesting. Whenever he's sort of saying what he wanted to do with his life, he says, I wanted to help souls. It's very interesting. He's one of the most famous priests in the history of the Catholic Church. And at no point in the autobiography does he say, I wanted to be a priest. That's kind of a startling thing. And it's good for us to remember that his experiences and the product of them, the spiritual exercises, are the work of a layperson. Ignatius was at this time an untrained layperson when he did it. It sort of puts a burden on all of us who are lay people. He wanted to help souls, and he started to do that. He started having spiritual conversations with people. He started helping them with their scruples. And he increasingly became attuned not only to anything that would help him help others, but anything that would hinder him from helping others. He seemed to acknowledge that he was a tough nut to crack. In the autobiography, he said, interestingly, God was dealing with him in the same way as a schoolmaster deals with a child, teaching him. Now, whether this was, Ignatius continued, because of his ignorance and obtuse mind, or because he didn't have anyone to teach him, it was his clear judgment that God was dealing with him in this way. He comes to the conviction that God is dealing directly with him, directly. And this is significant because it both emphasizes his obtuseness. You know, he's saying, I was a knucklehead, but God got through to me. all right? Some people like to think of this as God, the gentle schoolmaster. I think when Ignatius in the 16th century said God was like a schoolmaster, he may have seen God with the rod in his hand, right? That he needed to be disciplined, that he was, as I say, a tough case. And so what's interesting is this emphasis, this realization that he should not measure himself against others, but that he should let God reveal to him where he was called to go. This became a central feature of his life and his spirituality. It's around that point that Ignatius at Manresa comes to a deeper understanding of and consolation in God's creation. He was sitting there looking at creation all around him and having the direct experience of God. He recognized the good he was doing as he helped others. And so he moderated his fasting. He said, I don't have to beat myself up. I don't have to fast. I don't have to let my hair grow. So he cut his hair. He trimmed his toenails. He made himself more presentable. Maybe he began to realize that looking like a wild man wasn't going to actually get people to open their door to him. There's a pragmatic attitude in this way. And it was in this period that he had a very, very important experience while sitting by the river Cardener, an experience of enlightenment, which he describes in this way. By the way, this autobiography, since it was dictated, it's all in the third person. So the he and the his is Ignatius. The eyes of his understanding began to be opened. Not that he saw a vision. Interesting. Ignatius is considered a mystic, but he says, I didn't see a vision. This is the fundamental spiritual experience right here at the River Cardener, and he didn't have a vision. He said it wasn't a vision, but understanding and knowing many things, spiritual things, just as much as matters of faith and learning. It's more spiritual than theological or catechetical. And this was an enlightenment so strong that all things seemed new to him. He received a great clarity in his understanding, such that in the whole course of his life, right up to the 62 years he has completed, he does not think, gathering all he has had from God and all the things that he has come to know, even if he joins them all into one, that he has ever attained so much as on that single occasion. And this left him with the understanding enlightened in so great a way that it seemed to him as if he were a different person and he had another mind, different from that which he had before, unquote. This is really the culmination of the conversion, not the Cannonball experience, not, thank God, the experience with the Moor, not the scruples, not the beating himself up. It was something different, something that was always right before his eyes, and he hadn't really understood it before. Something that was always ancient and always new. Manresa is critical because it was the experience that was the basis of the spiritual exercises with which many of you are familiar. Manresa is the culmination of his conversion experience. He's keeping notes the whole time. He's writing this down, and he transcribes it into a book which eventually becomes the spiritual exercises, such that the whole point of the exercises is that the retreat director assists an individual in having an experience of God's love and mercy like Ignatius himself had. This, by the way, you alumni may be interested. This is the frontispiece of a 16th century edition, or actually an early 17th century edition of the spiritual exercises that is in the rare book room of the Griselli Library. And if you actually look at the bottom of the picture, you can see that it is actually from the Jesuit library at the college in the city of Hue in Vietnam. This was no doubt carried initially all the way to Vietnam by French Jesuit missionaries. Ignatius's experience and the spiritual exercises aren't important simply as a historical matter, although I'm fascinated by them as a historian. They're important for what they leave behind for the church and for those who work and live in Jesuit communities, Ignatian communities. It's about a fundamental awareness of God's love. That's what the freedom from the scruples was about. That's what it came from. It's about a recognition of a call to full humanity in freedom. And it's about the skill of discernment, of reading the spirits within oneself to discover, where is God calling me? Where do I experience consolation or desolation in my day, in my week, in my semester? And very much key to this is the idea of friendship or companionship with Jesus. This wasn't, as I say, you don't do the spiritual exercises so you get to be religiously smarter than anybody else. You do it because you want to encounter the person Jesus and enter into companionship, friendship with him. It's quite interesting. This rings very much true with the writings of both Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis, who really call the church to a greater and renewed encounter with the person of Christ. You know, not thesis statements, not total recall of the catechism, a personal experience of Christ. Now, I will also add the other thing that's interesting about conversions. Those of you who've ever studied any Thomas Aquinas when you were in college will recall that Thomas liked to say that grace builds on nature. If God wants to make a saint, he's got to start with a good human being to begin with. And keep in mind, God makes only good things. So this openness is to say, how can we build on this God-given nature of our own lives and become more? Not all of the old Ignatius was left behind or had to be extinguished. He remained courteous. He remained powerfully imaginative. How do you come up with a completely, not just a new religious order, but a completely new kind of religious order? That takes imagination. He remains completely generous. And those around him are known for their generosity and available. All of those human characteristics that in a way had always been a part of his life are now more fully developed and expressed than ever before. You might say they are not disordered. They are ordered to the correct ends. And there is this very strong apostolic focus in Ignatius to be on mission, to go out. Stop worrying about yourself. Stop worrying about whether or not you've done enough penances. Go out and do something for someone else. And what does this mean for us today? I want to repeat again, conversion is a process. It is continuous and ongoing if we're honest with ourselves. In fact, and this is where I'm going to be a little bit of the heretic this year. All the other Jesuits are talking about the Cannonball Moment. I want you to be careful about looking for Cannonball moments. If you keep looking for a Cannonball moment, you may not get one. And that could become an excuse to do nothing. Well, I'm just waiting here for that cannonball to come along, whatever way that is. No, we want to ask ourselves, can we be aware, as Ignatius eventually became aware, of what the Jesuit theologian Teilhard de Chardin called the slow work of God in our lives? The first step on the journey, to do something. You know, I often think, this is kind of an odd, some people might find this an odd analogy, but I like to use it. I like to cook. I'm not a chef. I'm not a gourmet cook, but I like to cook. And largely that's because I like to eat, probably too much. And one of the realities is that my brother-in-law got me a food magazine a few years ago. And, you know, when food magazines come out at the holidays, they always give you the ideal menu for whatever holiday is coming up. If it's the 4th of July, it's the perfect barbecue, right? If it's Christmas, it's the perfect Victorian Christmas. If it is Thanksgiving, we're going to give you the classic New England Thanksgiving, right? And then you start to read these things and you get through the whole thing. You say, boy, that's great, that's great, that's great. And then you get to the end of it and you can feel a little bit of desolation because I think to myself, I am never going to pull off this Thanksgiving dinner. But I could say, I'm going to start with one thing. I'm going to make that stuffing recipe, or I'm going to make those cranberries. I'm going to do one thing today. I'm not waiting for a cannonball. I'm not waiting to get everything done. I'm going to do one small thing. That's kind of the way I feel about the spiritual life, because if you read the biographies of the great saints, of all the great converted, whether it's St. Paul or St. Francis or St. Benedict or St. Dominic, or St. Ignatius, one can feel intimidated. And what I want to leave you with is that Ignatius doesn't want you to be intimidated. He doesn't want you to wait around for a cannonball moment. He told that story because he doesn't want you to be like him. He wants you to avoid the mistakes that he made. Don't even think about killing somebody who disagrees with you on theology. That's a good lesson for people to learn in the church today. Don't even think about being rash. Just take one step. Be aware of the slow work of God in your life. And remember that discernment is at the heart of what is a continual conversion in anyone's life, and indeed in the life of any community. I encourage you, if you haven't read it, read Pope Francis's little book, The Joy of the Gospel. It's a wonderful book. If you want to understand who Pope Francis is, read The Joy of the Gospel. And in it, he talks about the role of discernment and the need for the church to be open to change, to movement. That the church should not only be the teaching church, but a learning church. That it should discern the future. And in that, we can move forward as individuals and as a community. So thank you. That's all I've got for now, but I am very happy to take any questions anybody has at this point.
Well, thank you, Paul. I truly appreciate your willingness to be with us this evening. Do you mind stopping your share real quick? That way we can have a conversation and I can ask some questions.
Yeah, do that now.
Great. So one of the things that kind of has, this was an incredibly informative program, so thank you so much. One question that kind of came to my mind is St. Ignatius clearly, you know, if you think about him, he's groundbreaking in terms of how he thought about spiritualism and religion and kind of went through his own conversion. The other early Jesuits, when he approached them about the spiritual exercises, what were those? Did he speak much about that conversation, or how he brought Francis Xavier or Peter Faber along into Ignatian spirituality?
Yeah, it's interesting. As I say, he probably was a person of tremendously magnetic personality. He made friends easily. People like Xavier and Peter Faber, whose feast day we just celebrated, are good examples of that. I think part of the challenge is this was such a novel spirituality. It was not the spirituality of a monastery. It was a spirituality of people who were going to be on mission. And part of the challenge he had with the early Jesuits was to make sure they understood this, that they weren't just joining another religious order just like all the other ones. They were joining a religious order where if they were going to be contemplatives, they were going to be contemplatives in action. They were going to be on mission, that they weren't going to be living in a monastery. As one Jesuit put it, the world is our house. They're going to be out in the world, because if you can find God in all things, you don't need to be in the chapel or in the cloister. You can find it out in the world. So I think that was his challenge with early Jesuits. And he, in fact, had to send some of his closest friends around Europe to explain this to people who'd never met him, who thought they were just joining another religious order.
Thank you for that. I invite all of you, if you have other questions, please put them into the chat. One question that we did receive, did St. Ignatius have an experience with a guardian angel? of any sort? I know you showed the woodcut of him having the vision of the Virgin Mary and child. Did he ever have an experience with a guardian angel?
I don't remember that offhand. I'd have to go back and double check that. But it's interesting to get that question this week, because part of the work that I'm doing now is on this early Jesuit who was Ignatius's first biographer, Pedro de Ribadeneira. And Ribadeneira was certainly aware of his own guardian angel. So this is a kind of a devotion that would have been well known among the Jesuits of that day. But I don't know about Ignatius.
Right. Were there other saints that had a similar conversing experience to Ignatius, or was his pretty much unique?
I think each conversion experience is unique because every individual is unique.
Sure.
And this is one of the reasons it's interesting to compare and contrast these, because they all have some things in common. In fact, this is going to sound odd, but if you read about the conversion experience of Martin Luther, there are similarities because he experienced scruples too. And his confessor was trying to tell him to leave it alone. He just resolved it in a different way. And there are many people, especially in the early 16th century, who are experiencing anxiety about how to attain salvation. And Ignatius is one of them, Luther's one of them, Calvin is one of them. But there's a certain similarity in all of them. That's why actually comparing Francis and Ignatius, Francis of Assisi and Ignatius, is interesting, because Francis was also someone who was enthralled with the ideas of chivalry. In fact, he himself is injured in battle, is held as a prisoner of war, is kind of a shattered person when he returns to Assisi. And so there is a certain similarity there too. I think the product of it, to come up with the spiritual exercises, is the unique contribution. It's the greatest single contribution of Ignatius to the Christian tradition.
Okay. Charlie McCarthy asked a question about the spiritual exercises that you showed us that's in Griselli Library. What were the initials? I think it said BC or something similar before Ignatius's name. Do you know what those initials meant or mean?
Hold on one second. Let me look at that again.
Okay.
At the time that was published, he was not yet a saint. He was a blessed. So it's Blessed Father Ignatius of Loyola. Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense. Yep.
They had to be very careful. You didn't want to presume to call him a saint. Pedro de Ribadeneira, in referring to him, is always very careful, because it's the church that has the authority to say, someone is a saint. In fact, the Jesuits got in a little trouble with the Inquisition in Naples when they started hanging up pictures of their martyrs who hadn't been declared blesseds yet. They were told to take down the pictures until the church had named them that.
Fair enough. John Cunningham has a question for you. Did the Jesuits' focus on education come from this imagination and outward focus, or did it develop and evolve later? And obviously, there's a story with that hat, right?
There's a story with the hat. John Cunningham and I were once on an alumni trip together, and we found out separately that we had bought the same hat within 5 minutes of each other in the same small town in Italy. So I made sure I brought that hat for you today, John, in the hope you'd be here. I believe that part of it is that, as I said, Ignatius found that he wanted to help souls. And what is an effective way to help souls? At the time, during the Renaissance, there was a revolution in education going on. The humanist education of the Renaissance, where the scholars of that era were going back and recovering the literature of ancient Greece and ancient Rome in order to turn out well-trained, humanistically trained people who could serve both church and state and make the world a better place. I think the Jesuits wanted in their spirituality to help people become most fully themselves. And at the same time, they saw that this was going on already. So they didn't invent the curriculum, but boy, did they get on board and decide to run these schools in order to assist people to borrow the language of an ancient saint, Saint Irenaeus, the glory of God is the human person fully alive. And what we want to do in Jesuit education is assist our students in becoming fully alive. And that's why we talk about the education of the whole person, academically, spiritually, personally, in a holistic sense. And so I think the Jesuits just saw education was a great way of doing it. But it is connected to the exercises because of that core principle of helping people live full lives. Does that kind of make sense, John?
Well, we were very fortunate that they decided that education was a priority for them. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Another question, this one from Nicholas Hosmer. He says, thank you very much, Dr. Murphy. You mentioned that Ignatius experienced consolation in God's creation while in Manresa. Fast forward 500 years, the Society of Jesus has prioritized care for God's creation as a mission priority. Are these related, or is the current mission aligned with urgent environmental concerns?
I think it's, one of the jokes in Catholic studies is that when you want a Catholic answer, the answer is always both and, or yes and no. Nice to see you, Nick. And what I would say is I think it is rooted in that. But I think that the Ignatian understanding of God, finding God in all things, isn't actually originally Ignatian. I mean, I think it's a part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. If you go back and you read Genesis, God saw all that he had made, and indeed it was very good. There is something fundamentally orthodox in Christianity about the goodness of Christianity, a goodness of creation. And as a result of that, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that if one is going to be authentically Christian, or authentically Jewish for that matter, one must reverence the creation that God has made. Consequently, it would actually be theologically impossible to be a good Christian and not be concerned about the environment. That's not to say we're going to have couldn't have differences of opinion about strategies and things like that. But the reality is, it would be fundamentally, I think, the Jesuits, Pope Francis, and Ignatius would say that it's fundamentally blasphemous to abuse God's creation. And that would be true in terms of God's human creation, our brothers and sisters, or nature itself, without which none of us can survive. So I think it's actually, I'm not trying to weasel out of this, Nick. I think it's both and. It's rooted in the tradition, a tradition that goes back to Genesis, that goes back to Ignatius, but is also in this modern concern about the environment.
Thanks, Paul.
Great question.
Paul, a question from Paul Holzman. Which saints were included in Ignatius's reading while he was convalescing at the castle that impacted him the most?
Well, as I say, he seemed to mention Francis, Dominic, and for some reason, St. Humbert, who's not all that well known today. But these Lives of the Saints, I can remember when I was confirmed, somebody gave me a Lives of the Saints, which was a book where every chapter was a brief biography of a different saint. So I think there were a lot of different saints. It is very clear that as he was writing the constitutions of the Society of Jesus, he really did study the rule of St. Benedict. He read the rule of St. Francis. He read the rule of St. Dominic. He wasn't operating in a vacuum. It was important for him to see what had gone before. But I'd say other than those three, I couldn't really say. And he doesn't actually say himself in the autobiography.
Okay. We'll take two more questions. What miracle was used to make him a saint?
Well, there were several, some of them. In fact, I was just reading about this the other day in America Magazine. There was a woman suffering blindness for whom it was cured. But I honestly don't know what they were. I know the Jesuits were working very hard on getting him canonized. The interesting thing was, within a very short time, have you ever noticed this? That lots of people have statues of St. Francis of Assisi in their garden. But have you ever seen anybody with a statue of St. Ignatius in their garden? He doesn't give you the warm fuzzies the way Francis of Assisi does. And even within a decade or two of his death, St. Francis Xavier was more popular than St. Ignatius. After all, he was the heroic guy who went all the way around the world to preach the gospel in Asia. And what's interesting is that the Jesuits had to work very hard on Ignatius. And in fact, they were canonized at the same ceremony. And in some ways, Ignatius got pulled along on Xavier's coattails, you might say. In fact, it was kind of a remarkable day because Ignatius, Francis Xavier, Philip Neri, Teresa of Avila, and Saint Isidore the Farmer were all canonized on the same day. It was kind of a dramatic statement of the success of the Counter-Reformation. As the Romans like to say, the church canonized 4 Spaniards and a saint, because Philip Neri was from Rome. The rest were Spaniards. I don't know if that answers the question, but that would be.
I think it does, and I chuckle because as I'm looking outside my window, I'm sitting and looking at a statue of St. Francis of Assisi.
There you go.
So,
we'll try and find you one of Ignatius.
I would love to. Actually, you probably know this about me. I love art museums, and I go I love religious art, and I always go and look for, images of St. Ignatius, and it's pretty difficult to find it. He's not, at least not the ones I'm traveling to all that often. So, and the last question is about Martin Luther and Ignatius. They were sort of contemporaries. Luther thought he could reform the church from the outside in, while Ignatius thought he could reform the church from inside out. Who had the better approach, Ignatius or Luther?
Well, I guess that depends on whether you're a Catholic or a Lutheran.
Sure.
The reality is that I, as a historian, I'm not sure I'd put it one way or another. I think there are lessons for each group to learn from the other one if you're a Lutheran, there may be something to learn or a Protestant in general from reform that is done from within that refuses to break. And yet, on the other hand, I think we as a Catholic Church should also keep in mind that the cost of not reforming, the cost of not owning up to corruptions or need for change can mean rupture. In other words, you might get a Martin Luther whether you want it or not. So I think we have something to learn from both sides. Much was made of that. Pedro Rivadeneira, whom I mentioned a couple of times, the first biographer of Ignatius, actually was the first person to make the point that Martin Luther and Ignatius were basically born in the same generation. Luther was a little older than Ignatius. And of course, he argued that it was God's providence that Ignatius be born in that generation in order to counter the Protestant Reformation. Ignatius actually hardly mentions the Protestant Reformation in his autobiography. He's just more concerned about becoming a better Christian himself or helping others become a better Christian and a better human being. So I don't know what the answer is. I hope that doesn't seem like a cop-out, but No,
I don't think it does. I think that's a great way to understand. There's probably lessons that both the Protestants and the Catholics can learn from looking at the other way and how they reformed church either inside out or outside in. So Paul, again, thank you so much for being with us this evening. We are incredibly fortunate to have you within our community. To everyone who is on with us, Paul, before we started the program, we were remarking how Paul was actually our first A.C.E.S program during the pandemic, and he shared his experiences when he was over in Italy, and we have that video up on our YouTube channel if you're interested in seeing it. It's a really great discussion with our AVP of Alumni Relations, Dave Bitito. But I truly appreciate your willingness to be with us this evening, and we are just so fortunate that you teach our students and tonight teach our alumni. So thank you again.
Yeah, I will say it's a great privilege actually to teach the history of the Society of Jesus about once a year. And you get about 25 students sometimes hearing these stories for the first time. I particularly love telling the story of the surgeries that he underwent on his legs. The students certainly don't fall asleep at that point when you're talking about sawing off bone, but it's a wonderful experience to work with our students and to share this tradition that I think all of us kind of have grown to love and appreciate over the years. So thank you for involving me. I love talking to alumni.
Well, we love having you. So thank you again. And before we end this evening, I wanted to share with you all a few updates from the Office of Alumni Relations and the JCU Alumni Association. As we approach the end of summer, we often tire of the same food that we have been eating for the past few months. Join us on Wednesday, August 25th, as Chef Bob Safara from the JCU class of 1986 will share 3 dishes with us, sure to liven up your plate, as well as other tips to help create inspired cuisine this summer. This is part of our A.C.E.S series as well. On Saturday, September 25th, John Carroll University is launching a new tradition, the Blue Streak Supper Club. The concept is simple. One alum or couple hosts a dinner party and invites 2 or more alums to attend. Each attendee then donates the cost of their dinner back to our alma mater. It could be pizza, it could be wings, or surf and turf. This would all take place simultaneously on one festive night and be shared across all social media. It's a great way to reconnect with friends and support our alma mater all at the same time. For more information about the Blue Streak Supper Club, please email me at alumni@jcu.edu. And finally, save the date for Homecoming and Parents Weekend 2021. Highlights for the weekend include our annual Graduate of the Last Decade Social on Thursday, September 30th, the Athletics Hall of Fame Dinner on Friday, October 1st, and our JCU Alumni Association Awards Dinner on Saturday, October 2nd. Prior to the football game, gather with friends and fellow alumni for a Blue Streak tailgate. More information will be shared with our community in the near future. By the way, we're welcoming various alumni groups as well, including our men's soccer alumni, the U Club, and Pershing Rifles. You can find more information and register for all of our upcoming programs, including our Alumni Author Series, Scholarly Luncheons, and our A.C.E.S series at jcu.edu/alumni. Additionally, we invite you to view recordings of our previous programs on the JCU Alumni Association YouTube channel. To view our extensive library, search for John Carroll University Alumni on YouTube. And finally, please consider a charitable donation to John Carroll in support of our students, our outstanding faculty like Dr. Murphy, and our entire campus community. If you already made a gift this year, thank you for your generosity. If you have not, please join me in supporting JCU so that our current and future Blue Streaks have an outstanding education for years to come. You can make a donation by visiting jcu.edu/give. Thank you again for joining us. Take care, be well, stay safe, and onward on John Carroll.